Well, welcome into the True Man podcast. You know, one of the things that I pride myself on with the podcast is making sure that I bring you a wide range of topics to cover you if something gets sideways, because we know that it will at some point. So today's no different as we touch on a difficult subject of grief. So let's face it, at some point in our lives, we're going to have to deal with the death of a loved one. So how can you better prepare? Well, let's find out today. So welcome to the show, Phil Cohen. He's a keynote TEDx speaker, grief coach, and creator of the Grief Continuum, a framework for helping others grow, flourish, and overcome despair by discovering and developing their inner resilience. For over 25 years, Phil has helped global technology startups, and he helped me just a minute ago, grow and prosper through developing their sales teams. After experiencing the sudden loss of his son, Phil found a new renewed purpose, to help others to integrate grief into their own lives after experiencing the inevitable traumas, tragedy, and transitions in their life. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm really glad to be here today and to dive into the tough topic of grief. And as you so eloquently said early in your intro, pretty much nobody's making it out of this life unscathed. You know,
Taxes and death, right?
That's it. That's very true. You know, my purpose and my sole purpose in sharing my story is really to help others, inspire others who may be experiencing grief, particularly men. I find that I work with a lot of men. Generally, men start to push this thing away. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, I don't want to say I'm looking forward to diving into it. I wish we didn't have to, but we need to. And so so we're going to press into it. So, Phil, I had to refresh my memory a little bit about, your tragic situation as I was preparing to do the podcast. So I kind of had to dive in a little bit, and I remember your story from the news, but for those that may not, that might be a good starting point for us. Because that gets us to kind of where we're at and what you're doing today. So if you could refresh our memories a little bit, tell us about your story.
Sure. This was so on July 24th, 2015, my 14-year-old son, Perry, and his close friend were last seen leaving the Jupiter Inlet on a 19-foot fishing boat. And if you've ever lived in South Florida, Jupiter Inlet is in Jupiter, Florida. South Florida is really well known for storms coming out of nowhere. And one of those happened, winds carrying 40 miles an hour winds and rain. And after several unsuccessful attempts to reach the boys via their cell phone, the Coast Guard was notified. And I haven't confirmed this, but one of the most extensive, possibly the most extensive search in the history of the United States Coast Guard ensued. Neither of the boys were ever found. The search lasted 7 excruciating days. The whole thing played out on social media, a lot of national news outlets. And exactly what happened at sea that day still remains unclear. So that's where my intro to grief began. Because prior to that, I would have told you that I was really blessed to never have lost anybody that I loved. I did know one set of grandparents, but only one of them was alive, and I didn't have that great of a relationship with him. And other than that person, my entire family was still alive. And then suddenly I lost the most precious person in the world.
Yeah.
So it hit me really hard.
So, wow. I honestly, I don't even know where to begin because I can't put myself in your place. I just can't. So when you get that phone call, I don't know, was it a phone call or a knock on the door?
Yeah. So I got my ex-wife called me and told me Perry was missing and that the Coast Guard was searching for him. And that was the introduction to how it all started.
What's the first thing that goes through your mind?
Fear. Just absolute fear. I mean, if if the boys were lost in a field somewhere, or somewhere where I could physically
Yeah.
drive to,
Right.
I could
Right.
go there to where they were and, begin to walk a grid pattern day and night until I found them. But this was the Atlantic Ocean. Where do you begin? It's impossible. So fear, and then you say, and also just an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Just the fact that there was really nothing to do but just to search for him. And then ultimately, my goal became to keep the Coast Guard looking, because if you've ever lived on anywhere near the coasts, I live in San Diego now, but paddle boarders, people on sailboats, they go missing all the time. And the Coast Guard maybe looks for a few hours, maybe a day, but rarely ever do they search for a week. So my goal was to keep them looking in an effort to hopefully that they were found. But unfortunately, neither of them were.
What do you think kept the Coast Guard going in this case?
There was a lot. There's the fact is that they didn't find the boat until 2 days later. So they could have been on the boat. They could have been, if it had capsized, they could have been on top of it, or they didn't know. So unless they were first able to determine that they were in the water, then I had to have some really difficult conversations with Navy SEALs and admirals about the survivability rates once somebody is in the water. There's only a certain amount of time that a person can survive in the ocean. But they also had a large cooler with them. So we were saying, hey, these boys are, they've been on boats pretty much their whole life, avid fishermen. They could have been using the cooler. They could have been capturing rainwater. Each one of them could have been getting in. And so really just trying to say that, just keep looking, because there's a good chance they could be alive. And then after about the fifth, on day 5 or day 6, on the 6th day, I was sitting at the kitchen table across from the Admiral of the United States Coast Guard. And he said, listen, tomorrow we're going to be holding a press conference to publicly announce that the search is going to be coming to an end. Because after 7 days, there's pretty much no chance that anybody could survive in the water, because they did find the boat 2 days later. And that's when they knew that, and the boys weren't on it, so that they knew they were in the water.
When he's telling you that,
well, I'm sorry.
When he's telling you that, what, how do you take that? I mean, I know you don't want to give up. I wouldn't want to give up as a father. I wouldn't want to give up, but there's probably some level of like, yeah, you're right. But I mean, to hear those words from somebody, how did that impact you?
I was pretty much paralyzed. When I heard those words, I sat there, and at that point, there's not much more that I could ask them to do. They were using big boats and planes, and the Navy was involved, and there was a lot, and there was literally hundreds, if not thousands of people, just citizens out in their own boats, their own planes. Even several celebrities, offered to let us use their airplane. I mean, just the community involved, at large, was touching to see how many people really wanted to help find them. But yeah, I didn't know what to do, Mike. There's no preparation. There's no class. No one ever tells you, hey, this is something that could happen to you, so you should think about doing these things to prepare yourself. So I was in a thick, cloud of grief for a long time.
Well, yeah, that's understandable. Now we talked briefly prior to this podcast, and one of my questions to you, and I think this is, you had such an interesting answer that I wanted to bring this up. I asked you if you were a man of faith.
Yes.
And you told me a story, and I just think it's incredibly impactful when I ask you that. I guess in regards to, I think said you were 3 or 4 days in when this really
Yeah.
impacts you.
Yeah.
So tell that story.
Yes, it was like I'd say, I believe it was on the 5th day, before I actually had that conversation with the admiral, and I realized that I was pretty confident I was never going to see my son again. I actually went back into a room by myself and got down on the floor, face down, and said, "Okay, God, thank you." I don't know why I'm saying thank you, but as a man of faith, your word says to thank you in all things. And I believe that somehow you will make this great. Not that losing your child can ever be great. I want to make that clear, but that somehow, I'll be able to use this story to bring people to you, really.
Yeah.
And it's taken me almost 7 years to get to that point. And now that's the mission the Lord has me on, is to empower mostly men who are struggling with grief. And, I've got a framework to help people do that, but not only just to deal with grief, but to also how to take what's happened to you and use it to help other people.
To me, that's just an incredible story. Now, none of us knows how we would react, in the middle of a situation like that. But,
Yeah.
it says a lot about you and your faith that you had the ability in that moment to thank God.
Totally. Sometimes I'm even hesitant to tell that story, because, and generally, on podcasts, at least ones that are faith-based, I do, not every time, because, some people don't understand that. And I might not either if I hadn't had the foundation of faith going into this whole thing. And, prior to that, I was saved maybe 12 to 15 years prior to that date. And I remember, when I first started going to church and reading the Bible, a lot of my friends would say, like, "Well, that's great, Phil, but you really believe people live to be 800 years old and someone lived in the belly of a whale for 3 days? Like, you believe that?" And I hated that I couldn't answer that question with any type of certainty. It was just more like, well, I just kind of feel it, and I believe that there's a God. And so that frustration in not being able to answer that with any type of certainty led me to start to study apologetics. And then I started to dig into, the exegesis of the Bible and understanding how it was written in its original form and what the words really mean. And the more that I read, the more I realized that there is no way that this book of 66 books and 40 authors could possibly be coincidental, just with the dates and the numbers and the names. There's just way too much. So I was already convinced that there is a God and his word is the Bible. So when this happened to me, I turned to God and I thought, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? So even though I did thank God, only because I know that I'll be able to eventually bring glory to his name through this. And I'm still on that path. I don't have the end result in mind. I'm still there.
We all are, brother.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's right. So, right now.
I don't want to say the cool thing, because that sounds kind of cold, but the beautiful thing is you recognize you've gone through a trauma. And you can make a pivot and you can help other people as a result of that. So, you're going through this, and I'm sure the grief process takes time and you're learning a lot as you're going on. At what point do you go, you know what? I think I can really make an impact in other people's lives.
Definitely. So, it was probably about a year and a half, after just literally being on the floor in a ball, curled up in a dark room crying, because I didn't know what to do. I mean, there was times where I actually went back to work about 4 months later. It took me 4 months to kind of even just get up and even begin to like start to live my life. I lost 40 pounds and I walk around at about 170. So the weight loss was dramatic.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, like my first day at work, I actually was sitting at my desk and peed in my pants. Like I didn't even have the energy to get up to go to the bathroom. It sounds crazy, but I just sat there and went to the bathroom in my pants, and then texted one of my friends, and I was like, "Yo, can you go to the store and can you get me some underwear and a pair of jeans? Because I just did this." And it just goes to show you, like, you don't know how grief is really going to affect you. But I didn't know what to do. Like there's like I said, no playbook, no manual. Yeah. And yeah, it would be a good idea to go see a therapist, which I did, but how do you find one? Which one do you choose? What kind of therapy do you go to? So I actually started I Googled how to grieve because I didn't know what to do. And I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing the wrong thing or nothing, so that, it wouldn't really come up and really bite me later on in life. And if you Google anything around grief these days, you're going to run into the 5 stages of grief. And although I'm sure that that's helped a lot of people, for me, I felt almost like I was doing something wrong because I didn't grieve the way that it suggested and in the stages that it suggested.
Yeah.
So I really wasn't sure, but what actually turned it around for me was about a year and a half later, curled up on a ball on the floor. I like to say that I saw my son because I feel like I remember seeing him, but sometimes I question that if I really saw, but I could tell you I definitely heard him. And he looked at me and he said, "Get up, Dad. It's okay. I'll see you when you get here." And the way that he said it was so like, "All right, Dad, enough. It's been a year and a half. You've been on the floor for, crying." I would always talk to him about living life with passion and doing things that you love. And he was just like, "Go live your life with passion. I'll see you when you get here." And what that showed me was that, I was living in a world of guilt and shame. How come I couldn't save him? Felt complete worthlessness. I'm his dad. I should have been able to be there for him. And I just needed to give myself permission, and it's not that Perry gave me permission. He just showed me that I needed to give myself permission to heal. And from that day, I started using Post-it notes, and I would write on things like, "I give myself permission to heal." And I'd put them in my car and on the refrigerator and the bathroom mirror. And that was my pivot point, was to know that it's okay. This, regardless, like you said, something bad will likely happen to one of us. It's highly unlikely you're making it through this life unscathed. But at some point, you have to choose. Do you want to live there or not? And I knew that I didn't want to live in that space.
What a blessing, though, that you heard his voice. I'll say through God, right? That it lifted you up and inspired you to take action.
Yes.
I mean, that had to have just been the most peaceful feeling to hear his voice.
It was peaceful. And it just showed me like, that I need to do something, and like we've said a couple of times, there's an interesting metaphor for this. The fact is that we all experience storms, right? But the fact that is the only choice we really have is how we respond to them. And one of my friends who lives in the Rocky Mountains near Colorado told me about how Colorado is one of the only places in the world where both buffaloes and cows can coexist. And there's a really interesting metaphor about how each one of these deals with the storms. And I think it's applicable to this story. And so when the storms come over the Rocky Mountains, they almost always brew from the west and head east. Yep. And both the animals can sense the storms. But when the cows sense the storm coming, they start to run east, away from the storm. And what that does is they start to eventually run with the storm, and because the storm will catch up to them. If you know anything about cows, you know that they're not very fast.
I grew
So
up in
that
Iowa, so I'm very familiar with cows.
yeah. By running with the storm, they maximize the amount of time, pain, and frustration that they spend, in the storm. And I think as humans, we do the same thing. We have a tendency to run from the things that bring us a lot of pain and frustration.
Yep.
However, buffaloes are quite unique to the animal kingdom. What they do is they wait by the ridge of the mountain, and when the storm passes over the crest of the mountain, they turn and face to the storm and run at the storm and run through it. And by running through the storm, they minimize the amount of time, pain, and frustration that they spend in the storm. But notice how it's the same storm. And, the fact is that, we all have storms in our life. It's just a question of how are we going to deal with them? And I just want to make clear that I'm not suggesting that you don't grieve, that you don't take the time to heal. What I'm saying is it's a choice not to live there.
Well, I've been on to Colorado many times. I've never heard that about Colorado and buffalo and cows. It's actually an excellent analogy, quite honestly, to human beings. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And we do that. We will sit and spin. And since this is a show about men, we're particularly bad about it as men, right? We will bury that stuff deep down inside. And the reality is we need to face it like a herd of buffalo and deal with it up front.
Be the buffalo. Yeah. It's, I kind of make it the analogy to a beach ball.
Buffalo. That's it. We're going to use that line from now on.
Yes. That's, I'm in the process of writing a book, and I don't know if that's going to be the title, but that's part of it. And the real question is, how do you bridge the gap, right? How do you go from the cow to the buffalo, right? Because there are steps that you need to take. You can't just do it. There are steps. And that's
tell us about that. Cause that's probably a really, a great tip there on how can we be a buffalo in the middle of grief or any other storm that comes our way?
Well, the first thing is to decide, right? Because there is about, I'd say 10% of the people, 10% of mostly the men that I speak with, who will tell me something like, Phil, listen, I don't care what you have to say, what stories you're going to tell me, what tips or techniques or strategies you might have. I lost the most precious person in my life. My life is over. I am done. I've given up. I really don't care what you have to say. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, they're right. They're right. If they haven't made the decision to get up and to heal and to pursue healing, then they'll likely stay in that place. Yeah. And the other analogy I use is kind of trying to hold a beach ball underwater. Like, we could do it, and we could do it for as long, for a while. It's not like it's difficult to hold it there, but eventually it's going to slip out of the side and find its way to the surface. And the harder and farther we push it down, the faster and harder it comes up. And sometimes it even hits you right in the face. And that's the part that I want, men to avoid, because because of my story, I find that I work with men who have lost children. And what you'll see play out in families around the United States is that when a child dies, as a society, we have a tendency to flock around the mom. And I get that. I get that completely. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but most people will flock around the mom, including dad. Dad wants to be the rock. He wants to be the strong one. He wants to be the supportive for his wife. And he gets neglected a lot of the times. And oftentimes, I find that men, the last person they really want to open up with is their wife. So, I create a space to be able to allow them to feel safe and vulnerable, to be able to open up with me and to kind of express their feelings and their pain. Because I can tell you that the only way that I was truly able to begin to heal from indescribable amounts of pain was to really begin to feel the pain, to stop running from it, to acknowledge it, and even to just sit in it and allow it, and to be vulnerable in that space and not run from it. And over time, instead of running from the reminders and the memories and the birthdays and all the things that would remind me of Perry, I started to become connected to them. And that was by actually doing the work, So the first thing, as I say, is you have to make a decision to actually do it, and you can't do it alone. To cultivate community, you need people around you to be there for you. There are several steps, when my book comes out, I'd love to be able to send you a copy and
I love it.
Yeah. Get your thoughts.
This is such an interesting discussion because, when you're talking about that people rally around, the mother, and to me, right off when you said it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. On the other hand, as you describe it, I mean, we're really talking about masculinity and really how we've all been, men are raised as men and women are raised as men. And so we rarely talk about, our feelings and the vulnerability that comes with it, as most of us were raised, if you been around athletics like I have, and you get hit, just rub it out, don't say ouch, right? I mean, no crying in baseball type things, that mentality.
Yep.
But the reality is we all have a heart, we all have a mind, and we all have feelings. And, that just doesn't work when things go tragically wrong. And I think, when I talk about masculinity, these are the very topics that I talk about because it's okay. That is masculine. It doesn't mean you're any less a man, and you've got to face these things head on. So I'm glad to hear that you're approaching it from that standpoint, because I really feel like deep down inside, most men, I'm not going to say all men, that's what they really want. They want to know they're loved. They want to be in community, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I gave a TEDx on this subject of transforming grief. And in that TEDx talk, I even say, as men, we're basically brainwashed to believe that real men don't cry or share emotions or seek therapy. And that strategy won't work with grief. It won't. It will. You can't outsmart it or outrun it or outflank it. It's going to catch up to you. And I think, honestly, it takes more courage and it's more manliness to actually show your vulnerability and to be able to cry and let people know that you're in pain than to just try to stuff it away or walk away from it or go into another room so that someone doesn't see you cry. Because in doing that, that's where the healing comes from. That's where the healing comes from. It comes from opening up and from crying and from sharing it with other people. I definitely ran from it in the beginning, and I could tell you it caught up to me. And I used to start telling my story, about, to help myself almost, like it was almost like I started to share what was happening. And because people would open up to me and say, wow, okay, well, this is what happened to me. And we'd be able to talk about it together. And, that wouldn't have happened if I didn't share my story with them, instead of just be like, I'm not going to tell anybody and just kind of hide this, because it depends on the situation. Obviously, I don't go around sharing this with everybody, but, I can't tell you how many times over the past 7 years, people have asked me, do you have kids? And I'm not going to deny my son. I'm not going to just say no. And so sometimes I find a way around it, or sometimes I say, yes, I do. And they'll say, well, how old is he? And I'll say, he's forever 14 and a half. And it'll sit with them for a second and they go, oh, yeah, okay. And some of them will ask me questions, or some of them will just turn away and don't want to have that conversation. Yeah, which I understand as well.
Yeah. It's interesting because I commonly say, there's things that, we identify men, it's like, when you meet somebody, it's, what's your name? What do you do? And occasionally the kid, right? You know, how many kids do you have kids, type thing. And that people don't mean any harm by it, but
No.
and I've been on the receiving end of this, so I get it. I mean, when things aren't going well in your career and somebody asks you about your career, you just want to curl up, and there are times when I virtually did. And so I can imagine, what that feels like when somebody asks.
Yeah. And, biblically, I'm not sure if this actually means this, but Bible says, don't cast your pearls among swine. Right. So there's a lot of times, I don't share something so deep and personal with someone that, I just met, or not that person would be swine, but, I get a feeling of whether or not this person would be open to something like that. And if it's the right time, but in doing that, people will share with you. When you show your vulnerability or show something, that they'll say, you know what, let me tell you what happened to me. And then you could talk about it. And through the talking about it is where the healing really comes from. Yeah.
Well, I agree with that. And it's one of the reasons why, I think I resonate so much. Like, I haven't gone through trauma like you have, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I can't imagine that particular situation, but I gravitate towards comebacks, second chances, and pivots in people's lives. And, because we're all going to have them in our life. And I think it's important to make those connections. And it's really one of the reasons why, when I saw your information, I kind of gravitated to you, because it's like, wow, how do you come back from that? Like, I want to know that so that I can better prepare myself. Not that I'm expecting anything bad to happen, but the reality is it doesn't have to be a death. You can create resiliency in your life by practicing certain things. And is that something that you talk about as well? I mean, really getting into the resilience of various traumas in people's lives that pop up.
Absolutely. I'm 50 years old, and so I'm right on the brink of when people got tattoos. So like if I was born 10 years later, likely I'd have a lot more. But just about a year ago, I walked into a tattoo place, and just randomly, it was walking down San Diego, and I saw this place. I walked in, I started talking to this guy. He was Australian, and I decided I wanted to get. And I know people who are listening won't be able to see it, but I got the word resilience tattooed.
There it is. I didn't know that before I asked. Okay.
It's my only tattoo that I have, and because a lot of it really is about resilience, and similar to the cow and the buffalo story I gave, it's at some point you do have to choose. And the fact is, I know that with absolute confidence and conviction that my son would not want me to see me living the life that I was living before I made the decision to get up. So sometimes our grief can really be part of how we choose to honor and respect the ones we love, despite their physical absence. So, I want to make him proud. I know he's looking down on me, and through the work that I'm doing now, I know that when I do see him again, that they will be proud. So again, really, it comes down to a choice, because this thing happened. It happened. My son's not coming back. So either I can live in the, and I could have done anything, Mike. I could have done anything, like jumped off a bridge, became addicted to drugs, maybe, whatever it might have been. And people would have been like, I can understand. The guy lost his only child, like I could have done anything. Right. And so, people do have to take that time to grieve, and that will be unique to everyone. I don't think there are specific stages, and I don't think there needs to be a specific amount of time, that should be unique to somebody. But at some point you have to choose to get up and do something about it. Doesn't mean you have to use that to help other people. That if that's what God is calling you to do, like he's put in my heart, then I could help people do that. But I think at some point, just being able to talk through it and facing the reality, and there are certain ways to think about it. But I don't want to go too deep into that point of it. And the other thing, I just want to touch on one thing that you said. Yeah. That you said, I've never experienced trauma like you. Now, my wife and lost her mom like 3, maybe 4 years ago. And she said to me that she didn't want to cry in front of me because like her grief, she felt wasn't anything compared to mine. And
Mm.
I want people to, whoever's listening, that, although whether you lost someone you love, or whether you lost a job, or whether you lost a dream, that will bring on grief.
Yeah,
So
it's a good
grief
point.
is grief. It doesn't have to be losing a child or be something as dramatic as that. There are several things that can happen in life that will bring grief into our lives, and we could still take the same steps to be able to get out of it.
Yeah, I remember, gosh, it's been a number of years ago now, but we had adopted a greyhound dog. It was actually before my wife and I even had kids. And I had to put that dog down. He just couldn't, walk anymore, and it was going to become. And boy, oh boy, that really hit me. I mean, that really hit me hard. And it started right there in the beautiful vet. They prayed, with us, and they're like, "You can go out the back door." I'm like, "Thank you. I think I will." And boy, I could barely make it home.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like some people would say, "Oh, that's nothing compared to this or to that," but that's not true. You go through the almost the exact same type of process. It's the same grieving process that people go through. Yes, there's going to be grief that's going to be deeper than
Yeah.
others, but it's something that we all experience. And I just don't think it's fair. Like, so recently a woman interviewed me in the Wall Street Journal, and she also lost her father. And we had a conversation prior to her writing the article. She was interviewing me, and I could tell that this woman loved her father. Like he was a very, very important figure in her life, and she was really feeling it. And so she wrote an article about, she wanted to find people that have gone through grief and different ways that they've used to overcome it.
Mm.
And so she printed the article, and someone in the comments said, "Well, losing your father is nothing like losing a child." And I just disagree. I disagree that, I think grief is grief. There may be certain levels of it, but I can tell that the amount of pain that she was feeling was very similar to the amount of pain that I felt. So I just wanted to just throw that out there, that if someone's listening and they're grieving and they may not have lost a child, that it's not fair for them to feel like, it's not the same.
No, thanks for saying that. Honestly, I mean, I think it is tough because I have two children, and I can't put myself in that position. But yeah, have I experienced grief in my life? Yeah, a lot, right? And I think we all do. And I certainly want to be better prepared, in the future. But thanks for saying that. I do think that that's an important thing to touch on. In fact, as we begin to wrap up here today, I just want to, because this is such an important topic, I just want to make sure that I have not missed anything. If there's anything that you just wanted to share with the audience before, we begin to wrap up, that we may not have touched on regarding grief.
I think we definitely did touch on a lot. And I would just say that, if anybody is out there and is experiencing grief and they don't know what to do with it, I'm not sure if there's going to be a link on their site, on your site.
I'm going to go ahead and give your contact information, and then I'll put it in the show notes, all the information.
This is what, I've developed a program. I call it the Grief Continuum. I have 3 pillars. It's reflect, repair, and repurpose. And I will walk you through the pillars. I offer a free, 30 or 45-minute session, a call with me. And it doesn't mean that you have to continue if you don't want to, but I just would like to be able to put that out there, that I do a lot of these one-on-one sessions, and I feel like I could be super helpful with people, especially men, because if there's guys out there listening who are going through things and you're pushing it down and you're afraid to share it with your wife, and you spend the birthdays and the date of death, by yourself crying and ugly crying because you don't want anybody else to see you. I get it. I was there. I know a very similar pain. And please reach out to me. I would love to be able to help in any way that I can.
Well, thanks for that. We will we'll put that information in the show notes, and I really appreciate you being on the podcast and sharing this information. It's just really, really important topic, because it gets into mental health, and you don't want to go down a rabbit hole that you don't need to if you can avoid it. So, Phil, thanks for being on today, and thanks for sharing your story, and blessings to your family.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Thank you.